Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. So we're going to be talking today about a study that we completed over the course of 2018 in partnership with FINRA's Investor Education Foundation and the CFA Institute about millennials and investing. We've, in partnership with FINRA and CFA Institute, packaged the results in sort of the context of 7 myths. I'm going to take you through the data in a little more detail. Hopefully if I get through everything, we do have time at the end to kind of go through it myth by myth. And then you can certainly, I provide the link to their website where you can they have a big infographic on the 7 myths of reality, but we're going to go a little deeper into the data than just that level. So I want to tell you a little bit about the study that we did. An online survey we ended up with a little over 2,800 respondents. Sampling was a little different because we wanted to, FINRA Institute and the CFA, or FINRA Foundation and the CFA Institute had 3 segments that they went into this wanting to focus on. And you'll see differences in those 3 segments throughout the presentation. They are all millennials, but they wanted to divide millennials into 3 groupings. And the first are those millennials with no kind of investment accounts, so nothing outside, bank accounts. The second are millennials that have some type of retirement account, be it an employer-sponsored retirement account or an IRA, but nothing else, nothing in addition to that or outside of that. And the third millennial segment are those with some sort of taxable investment account. Now, they may also have a retirement account, but they have something in addition to that, whether that's, a brokerage account, mutual funds, even individual stocks, something beyond just a retirement account. So we wanted to make sure we had adequate sample in each of those groups. You can see here in this table that we had about 600 in each group, but we also wanted to understand what proportion of the population they represent. So what we did is our first 1,000 millennials, we balanced our sampling based on census data and let it fall so we could kind of see the proportions. And then we used the rest of our sampling to kind of fill out those numbers. And then we weighted the data set back to the actual proportions. We also did 2 segments, one with Gen Xers and one with Boomers as a comparison point. With both of those, we focus on the taxable investment account group. So we really could only compare that to our millennial taxable investment account group. I'm going to provide you a link at the end of this presentation to FINRA's website. They have provided access to the survey and to the full data set. So it's completely open here. You can download the data, dive into everything as much as you'd like. So I want to just do a brief overview of the 3 segments I mentioned, kind of what they look like, how they compare to each other. So as I mentioned, we had millennials who do not have any kinds of investments. We have millennials with retirement account only, and then we have millennials that have some type of taxable accounts, potentially in addition to retirement accounts. You can see some pretty stark differences on a couple of the variables here. You can see that the millennials with taxable investments are much more likely to be male than the other 2 groups. Both the group that have no investment of any kind tend to be less educated than the other 2 groups, and you'll see that translates also into less likely to be full-time employed. They're also, those who have taxable investment accounts are more likely to be Caucasian, more likely to have dependent children. Biggest difference you can see at the bottom there is income, and that shouldn't come as a big surprise. That makes sense in the context of what we're looking at here, that those who have a higher median income tend to be more likely to have some either a retirement account or taxable investments. I'm going to talk a little bit about millennial financial goals. One of the myths that we debunked to some extent is that there was, the conventional wisdom was that millennials have very lofty goals. They all want to retire at 50 and be millionaires. And we definitely did not see that play out. So you will see that there's differences in our 3 groups, with those with taxable accounts having more aspirational goals, wanting to save. But even those goals are not, very lofty. They want to save enough to retire when they want and live comfortably, have enough to travel. But if you look at the other two groups, you can see that on the left, they're much more day-to-day goals, right? They want to be able to pay their bills. They want to not live paycheck to paycheck. They want to have savings for unexpected expenses. So you can see, obviously, and this is related to income as well, that the people in the non-investing group have a lower income. They tend to be dealing with more day-to-day goals. The millennials, you can see the millennials with taxable accounts that do tend to have a little bit more lofty goals are more in line with the top goals we see for the Gen Xers and the Baby Boomers. So they're thinking about those same things. I also want to mention that when we asked all our millennial respondents when they expect that they will retire, we saw on average that millennials expect to retire at 65. That's what came back. And so, they're not looking to retire early. Now, whether 65 is a reasonable age once millennials get to retirement age, that may need to be pushed out. It may not be a realistic goal, but it's not like they're all looking to retire early. That's not what we saw in our data. One of the other things we looked at were, what were some of the barriers to investing? What's stopping millennials from investing? And again, this is where one of the myths comes in. And here's where this myth is the least of the myths because it's partially true. One of, the conventional wisdom was that the barriers to investing would be debt and income. That is true. Debt and income are the most cited reasons why folks are not either have any investment account or those who have retirement accounts only why they're not don't have any taxable accounts. However, one of the things that we point out is throughout the results when we're kind of talking about this area is that knowledge is another key factor. And this played out in the data in a couple different places. You can see here that one of kind of the secondary factors after, being focused on paying off debt, not having enough income, not having enough savings, is not enough knowledge, not knowing. And you'll see throughout, those who have resources, those who whose parents talk to them about investing, they're all more likely to be in that taxable investment group. And so while debt and income are absolutely significant barriers to investing, one of the things that came out from this research is that lack of knowledge is a big issue. There's another really key issue when it comes to why folks are in that no investment at all bucket, and that's really access. You can see on this slide, looking again at the three groups, this is looking at their employment and whether they have an employer-sponsored retirement plan available to them. So if you look at the non-investing millennials on the left, you can see they are by far much more likely to not be full-time employed. And then if they are full-time employed, they are much less likely to have an employer-sponsored retirement plan with a match. So, one of the things we realized is that, there's a gateway to investing, and that starts with having a retirement plan available to work. For a lot of folks, and I should have mentioned up front that we did extensive qualitative research before we did this quantitative survey. We did focus groups with a variety of millennial groups and boomers and Gen Xers. And what we heard there is echoed here, and that is having that employer-sponsored retirement plan as a stepping stone to investing. It's the way they're introduced to investing, and oftentimes gives them access to an advisor, and it gets them closer to that next step of having taxable investment accounts. Those who don't have any of this, are less likely to have that opportunity and availability. So again, one of the big barriers, in addition to income and debt, is access, is having access to the retirement plan at work. In terms of those who do have retirement plans, we asked a little bit about auto-enrollment, and that's something that's becoming much more more and more common. 52% of the millennials that have a retirement plan through work say that they have auto-enrollment as part of their policy, and they're very, very positive towards the idea of auto-enrollment. There's sometimes folks worry that people there's going to be backlash or they're not going to like it. And we do see a little bit of that with older populations. But millennials, 75% have a positive feeling about the idea of auto-enrollment. And we ask that of everybody, even if they don't currently have a plan with auto-enrollment. You can see those that have taxable accounts are even more positive. But even among the non-investing millennials, most are positive towards the idea of auto-enrollment. We asked our non-investors what might get them to invest, what might get them to take the next step. And again, you see this 44%, the largest circle here is more money, right? They don't have enough income, they don't have enough savings, they're living paycheck to paycheck. So that's clearly, the biggest thing that would get them to be able to invest. But the next biggest thing, and again, this was an open end, so this was, kind of unaided, was knowledge. And this comes back to what I mentioned before, as knowledge being a potential driver towards investing. So you can see the quote here, I have no idea where to start, maybe read up on it. So they definitely want more knowledge. They want a better understanding. That came through a lot in our qualitative research as well, just not knowing what they don't know and not knowing how to get there. Women are even more likely to say knowledge would help them start investing. Another myth or conventional wisdom that didn't bear out in our data is that millennials are very confident. They're overconfident. They think they know everything. They're self-taught. They can go out, and figure it all out on their own. And they're perceived to be overconfident in general, but when it comes to decisions about investing, there's less confidence there. So more than half, 54%, lack confidence in making investment decisions, and that's of those who have a taxable account. More than half of those who are investing lack confidence in making those decisions. Obviously, that number is much higher when you're looking at the non-investing millennials and the millennials with retirement accounts only. You're in the 80%, not confident, 79% for retirement accounts only. So there's definitely, and again, ties into the knowledge. They don't feel educated about this necessarily. They don't feel confident in being able to make those decisions, and that can be a barrier. A really interesting finding that we didn't expect to see is that millennials who invest, who have taxable accounts, were more likely to start younger. So we asked everybody kind of when they started investing, and you can see here, this is the percent, these three circles are the percentage who say they started investing under the age of 21. So millennials, 31% of millennial investors started before the age of 21, compared to 14% of investing Gen Xers and 9% of investing Baby Boomers. You look down at the bottom here, if their parents or family members talked to them about investing, that increased the chances that they started young. So those who talked to their kids before they were 18, 50% of those started investing under 21. If they didn't talk to them until they were an adult, that number drops to 23%. If they never talked to their parents, that number drops to 12%. And we see in other parts of the data, I don't know that I have all the detail here in this presentation, that those whose parents at any point talk to them about investing are much more likely to be in that taxable account group. And some of that may be related to socioeconomic class and having parents who invest and talk to them about investing. But definitely, and we also, find that that's one of the motivators for why millennials started investing, those who do, is that their parents influenced them and talked to them. So I want to talk a little bit about millennials' usage of and attitudes towards financial professionals. This was another one of our myths, was that millennials would be really have a lack of trust when it comes to the financial industry, and that would translate to a lack of trust in financial professionals. And that is not something that we saw in our data. 41% of our millennials who invest use a financial professional. So, not a very high number, but we'll look a little bit as to why they do and don't. Those that do, though, tend to really like their financial professional. 72% are highly satisfied with their current financial professional. So they aren't skeptical, they aren't unhappy, they tend to like that professional that they work with. And then again, this was very consistent with the qualitative. Those who had a relationship with a financial professional were very positive. We have a slide, I think I have it in the back here, I'm not don't have it as the main part of my deck, but where we asked in the qualitative, we asked our millennial respondents to bring up words that come to mind when they think of financial advisors or financial professionals. And most of those words were positive, expert, knowledgeable, advice. There were some negative words, but for the most part, the positive really outweighed the negative. And that was even among non-investors. So there doesn't seem to be this sort of negative feeling about financial professionals, even if there might be for the financial industry at large. Interesting kind of side piece of data here. We asked everybody whether if they work with a financial professional, whether they checked their current financial professional's background in a regulator's database. Interestingly, millennials are much more likely to do that than older generations. So 54% of our millennials are taxable investors who work with a professional, did some digging, checked out their advisor before they worked with them. Only 38% of Gen Xers did this, and only 26% of Boomers did that. So there seems to be a little bit of a shift in how they're going about selecting and deciding who they're going to trust. When we looked at why millennials do or do not work with a financial professional, what we saw is the reasons why millennials cited not working with a financial professional. Cost was the biggest factor. The idea that it's too expensive. And I'm going to show you in a second what millennials think it costs to work with a financial professional, which is not accurate, but they think it's going to be very expensive. When you look at trust, that's way down on the list. It's much less of a factor. It's not really a barrier. Those that do work with financial professionals say it makes them feel more confident and that really they're hoping for better performance for their money. We asked what type of factors impact the relationship with a financial professional. What's most important in building that trust and building that relationship? And we found that really, and this we heard in the qualitative as well, that they really want someone to educate them. And this, does play into the stereotype about millennials, going on and watching YouTube videos and teaching themselves how to do things. They do not want someone to do it for them completely. They want someone to educate them and work with them. One of my colleagues at the CFA Institute made the comment that, millennials seem to want someone to be a teacher more than they want someone to be their friend. So if you look at the bottom of this list, getting to know me as a person, not about the friendship, it's about educating me and working with me, explaining why you're making the decisions that you're making. And knowing that the professional is putting their interest first is also important. And this, ties into the whole fee-based versus commission-based compensation structure for advisors. Millennials definitely want to make sure that their interest is coming first. So that's something to think about there as well. Interestingly, and something else we did not expect, so kind of playing into the myth, is that 58% of millennials would rather work face-to-face with an advisor. That's their preference. So, while they are digital natives and they tend to do a lot with technology, they still, for this, want that face-to-face relationship. And again, we heard this in the qualitative as well in a little bit more depth, that for them, their money is important enough that they want to have that connection and that relationship. It doesn't have to be physically in an office together. It could be video chat. It could be a lot of phone, but they want a relationship. They don't want a robo-advisor, and we're going to look at that as well. They really want it to be relationship-based. So we thought one of our myths was that millennials would overestimate how much they need to have in assets for a financial advisor to be willing to work with them. So we thought that millennials would say, well, I'm not working with an advisor because I don't have enough money, and I need to have more money to be able to work with an advisor. In fact, we saw that millennials underestimated the amount of investable assets they need to be able to work with an advisor. So 20% said there's no minimum amount to have that relationship, and 6 in 10 believe a financial professional would work with them if they had $10,000 or less. Now, this isn't necessarily wrong. There are ways to get financial advice and work with financial professionals with lower asset levels, but that relationship with, face-to-face relationship with a financial advisor, many financial advisors have a much higher threshold to be willing to work with a client than $10,000. I mentioned before that millennials don't have a good sense of how much professional financial advice costs. They really, 42% straight up, when we asked what the typical fee might be, say they don't know. They didn't even, hazard a guess. We asked them kind of what percent of their assets might be the typical charge for advice. 42% wouldn't answer the question. 77% of those who did answer the question believe that a financial advisor is going to take 5% or more of their investable assets in order to provide that advice. So they really either don't know or wildly overestimate the cost for professional financial advice. And that ties into one of the barriers to using a financial professional that I showed earlier, which is that they think it's too expensive. So we did look at some familiarity and interest in emerging financial products and services. I mentioned robo-advisor, that was one of them. So we looked at 4 different products and services: robo-advisors, socially responsible investing, cryptocurrencies, and investment crowdfunding. You can see in that green column, very, very few millennials have used any of these. So, fairly low single digits. Cryptocurrency is a little bit higher. If you look at the very familiar, very, very few millennials are familiar, or at least very familiar, with these 4 kind of new and upcoming options. And, a significant minority have not even heard of some of these things. Again, cryptocurrency being in the news, most folks have heard of them. And then we asked interest, and we described, so I should say, because we did have a lot of people who weren't familiar or had not heard, so we gave a little description of what each of these 4 things were, and we asked potential interest. You can see that the very or extremely interested in using numbers are quite low. Only 16% would be interested in robo-advisors. The highest would be socially responsible investments at 23%. So, again, one of our myths, because we felt that millennials would be much more interested in some of these new and upcoming either technologies or ways of doing things, and we just didn't see that. It just hasn't hit that threshold yet where folks are really jumping in. There were, some important segment differences across millennials. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to touch on a couple because, another kind of myth that we put out there, or conventional wisdom or approach, is that a lot of people treat millennials as if they're one homogeneous segment of the population. I mean, I know we all know that's not true, but sometimes they are all lumped together as one group. And so we wanted to kind of pull out where that was not the case. And again, there's more than I'm showing you here, but one of the key ones was this rural-urban divide. And I should say that we looked at suburban as well, and that falls very close to urban. The rural millennials are really at risk of being left behind. Fewer invest now. You can see, 18% in the taxable investor versus 27% urban. Fewer plan to invest in the next 5 years. Fewer are employed full-time. They show less confidence in their decision-making and their ability to reach their goals. And they tend to be more negative about their situation. They're less likely to think that they're going to be better off than their parents, or that their children are going to be better off than they are, less optimistic. So there's really this divide where rural millennials are just not being given the access, the opportunity, the confidence to invest. Another place, and I think I referenced it maybe once or twice in the presentation, is the gender divide. Women are also less likely to be in that taxable investor bucket, less likely to be full-time employed, also less likely to be confident in their decision-making and their ability to reach their financial goals, less optimistic, more likely to say knowledge is a barrier to investing, and that more knowledge would make them more likely to invest. So another area where there may need to be more specific messaging or targeting for women versus men. We didn't really delve into kind of the whys of that. That wasn't really in the scope of the research, but definitely a divide here. So now I just kind of want to wrap up a little bit. I know I referenced throughout the myth versus reality. I didn't start there, but just to kind of sum up, I mentioned that, one of the conventional wisdoms that millennials would have lofty goals, starting a business, retiring early, which would carry over to their goals and aspirations. We didn't find that. We found, all the groups expect to retire at 65. Non-investors are less likely to believe they'll even be able to retire at all. Millennials with taxable investments do have more ambitious goals than the other two groups, although even those are not, very lofty. In terms of the implications, I mentioned before, retiring at 65 actually, although historically has not been a lofty goal, may not be a realistic goal in 2046 when when the oldest millennials are turning 65. I mentioned that one of the, the conventional wisdom would be that the biggest barriers to investing would be income and debt. They are big barriers, so I only call this half a myth because that is true, but lack of knowledge is also a major hurdle, as is access to having an employer-sponsored retirement account. So those are two really big factors that are preventing people from going from that non-investor bucket into the retirement only and then into the taxable accounts. Financial education, should acknowledge income and debt, but there are opportunities for employer-based retirement plans and education, even potentially in part-time work, because one of the things we saw is that those who had no investments were less likely to have full-time employment. And so that could really help, that access could definitely help change the picture for that group. One of the other myths is that millennials would be overconfident, and that would spill into their financial lives. We did not find that. They still feel like there's a lot to learn. They don't feel super confident in their financial decisions. Those taxable investors are more likely, but even they are not, super confident in their financial decision making. So, having financial education that's, tailored to different mindsets. One of the things we heard in the qualitative was those who don't have the knowledge are embarrassed. I mean, they don't even want to talk about it. They don't want to talk to their friends about it. They're hesitate to go to a financial advisor because they're embarrassed about their lack of knowledge. So that's something that needs to be, dealt with in communication, that, you're not alone. There are others in that boat, kind of taking people step by step. Another myth was that millennials would be wary of the financial services industry and skeptical of advisors. We really didn't see that. Those who use an advisor are highly satisfied. They view their relationship as collaborative. Those who don't use an advisor really cite expense or not being able to find an advisor and not lack of trust. So, that it's going to be interesting. Financial advisors need to think about how they can be a resource for millennials. Maybe think about some of the things here around the millennials wanting that relationship, not wanting to use a robo-advisor. And, there have been more and more resources available to those who don't have high levels of assets to be able to give them professional advice, whether for a flat fee. There's different models out there that are providing access to folks who don't have a huge amount to invest to get them started. Millennials, we thought that maybe millennials would overestimate the assets they need to work with an advisor. And as I mentioned, we did not see that. They really didn't think there was a threshold, or they thought it was a very low threshold. And importantly, they have really no sense of what the fees are to work with a financial advisor. They are much more likely, I didn't show the comparison point on the slide, but they are much more likely than Gen Xers or Boomers to overestimate advisor fees. We know advisor fees are not typically 5% plus. If they are, you should probably be looking for a different advisor. So again, this is where education comes in. That's the role of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, to really help people understand this. And, something that came out as we were presenting this data was that advisors tend to be reluctant to want to talk about fees, want to disclose their fees, want to have that conversation. They avoid it, or they do it as minimally, just as necessary. And that might not be the best approach. In some cases, people might be, pleasantly surprised at what the actual fees are. And those with lower asset levels, again, I mentioned, can benefit from new solutions or solutions out there that might be aligned with their resources, like robo-advisors, which don't typically have a minimum, or, again, the emerging segment of advisors who are finding ways to work with lower asset investors. And finally, we thought that being digital natives, that millennials would gravitate towards robo-advisors, but not the case. Very few are using. There's limited awareness and there's limited interest. We really saw that they want that relationship. When we spoke to people in the qualitative, they really didn't get how that would work. There was more of a trust issue there than there was with the individual relationships. And I'm sorry, the last one's actually what I mentioned about millennials being a homogeneous group, and that was not the case at all. We see lots of different sort of cuts within millennials, people with different needs and in different places in their lives, whether that's geography, rural versus urban, gender. We also saw differences, some differences on age. So that's an important consideration when working with millennials. So that kind of wraps up my content. There's so much more than I even put forward here, and all of it is available to you. I put the link here for the FINRA Foundation.org/millennials, where there's the full detailed report. There's an infographic. There's a fantastic video that the FINRA Foundation put together where they talked to some millennials, interviewed some millennials, and really illustrated a lot of what we found. And there's the data. You can actually access the survey, the questionnaire, and the full data set. So I urge you to take advantage of that. There's lots of questions that aren't even part of this presentation. That's a lot of different cuts in the data. Yeah, so anybody have any questions, please feel free to put them on here. I have my contact information up here, my email address. Happy to talk offline about the data or about any specific questions or subsets in the data.